Please welcome President of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice and former President of Ireland, Dr. Mary Robinson.
Good morning everyone to this very special session. It's a pleasure to see many familiar faces. I hope there'll be more before the session is over. And we're gathered here this morning to discuss, I think to strategize on how we achieve climate action that is fair, inclusive, and of course, gender responsive. In the spirit of commitment that the Global Climate Action Summit calls for, I ask that all of us here use the time we have this morning to understand how we, as individuals, or as representatives of a city, state, country, company, or civil society organization, can take it upon ourselves to further the empowerment of women in climate action. All of us here know that we must take action. We know that we must take it with urgency, as we are now in a struggle for our very survival and the survival of all future generations not yet born. However, if we don't pay sufficient attention to the fact that in order for climate action to work, we must ensure that the dignity of all people is respected in all climate action taken. I've noticed around the city all the signs that read, "Climate change isn't fair." The profound injustice of climate change is that those who are most vulnerable in society, no matter the level of development of the country in question, will suffer most. People who are marginalized or poor, and indigenous communities, indeed people with handicap, are being disproportionately affected by climate impacts. Similarly, climate action itself can be unfair. It can exclude, it can trample on rights of people in vulnerable situations, and it can reinforce existing inequalities, locally and internationally. We mustn't allow this to be the outcome of our efforts. In her acceptance speech for the Sydney Peace Prize, author and activist Arundhati Roy said something that really resonates with me. She said, "We know, of course, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." To many, this is a confronting statement, but it's true nonetheless. We who are in a position of decision-making power, or who engage in processes that will ultimately affect the lives and decide the fate of whole swathes of the planet's people, cannot do so in isolation. We have a moral imperative to ensure that there is no one preferably unheard. Women across all communities are agents of change, and we'll not succeed in tackling the climate crisis if we fail to include their voice and harness the agency of women's leadership. Gender-responsive climate action must begin with women's participation. It's imperative to bridge the divide between communities on the front lines of climate impacts and the decision-makers who are shaping national and international responses on climate change. On Wednesday, I was proud to co-host a roundtable dialogue on women's participation with Chair Mary Nichols of the California Air Resources Board and Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa of the UNFCCC. A group of 60 women, and I'm glad to say supportive men, gathered to share their stories, reflections, and ideas in response to a central question: how do we overcome the barriers to women's participation, and particularly grassroots and indigenous women in climate action? The conversation was rich, and afterwards we distilled the critical enabling elements that the participants identified. And I said I would, and I now would like to share these with you here today. First of all, finance. Money must be available to support the participation of women from the front lines of the struggle against climate change. Current resources made available to facilitate women's participation are totally insufficient. 2, capacity building. Support and training must be provided to help women, particularly from frontline communities, to articulate their expertise to decision makers. 3, spaces. Spaces must be created to enable women to sit at the decision-making table. Where pervasive inequalities exist, quotas should be used. And finally, we must simply change our mindset. Women deserve real and meaningful participation in decision-making on climate change. So please bear these points in mind as we move through our discussions here today, and please keep them in mind when you return to work next week. I think we need to challenge ourselves. We all need to challenge ourselves and ask how we can empower women through our own work. So let's do it. Let's get on with the program. And I want to start with introducing Dr. Thani Ahmed Al-Zayoudi, whom I know very well as a friend, Minister of Climate Change and Environment for the United Arab Emirates, to tell us about the approach to gender-responsive climate action. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Mary. Good morning, all. I'm very pleased to be with you all today this morning, as both climate change and women empowerment is at the heart of the UAE's national priority. I'm really pleased that this session is held in the presence of Her Excellency Dr. Mary Robinson, who has been a long-time friend to the UAE. We have been organized events together in the past and promoted the role of women in addressing climate change and clean energy development in order to ensure the sustainable development. You may recall that the UAE was one of the leading countries to support the adoption of a decision at the COP18 UN Climate Change Conference in 2012 to promote the gender balance and to improve the participation of women in climate change and climate negotiation UN bodies. This decision was being at the basis of the UN's gender work stream since then. The reason for our support is simple. Not only do women constitute half of our population, but they are disproportionately affected by the impact of climate change in many parts of the world. Yet, they are often the holders of knowledge and experience, or have the potential to help us address the climate change. In our views, it is a missed opportunity if we do not engage them. In the UAE, our leaders has long believed in the role of women and has strongly supported raising profiles of women participation in our society. For example, 77% of Emirati women enroll in higher education after secondary school, and they comprise around 70% of the UAE's university graduates, of which 46% are in the STEAM field. Furthermore, Emirati women constitute 66% of our public sector labor force and occupy about a third of senior level positions in the government, including 9 women ministers. Likewise, sustainability and resource conservation has been long embedded in our traditions, as we were highly dependent on our land and sea, integrated into the developments of our country over the past decade. Today, we are leading the world by large-scale deployments of renewables, renewable energy, water, and energy efficiency measures, including green building codes and adoption of public transport systems. And many women are taking the challenges role of advancing our sustainable development agenda in all relevant fields, including climate change negotiation, where on average over 50% of our delegates are female. In terms of support, there are many capacity building programs in the UAE, most notably Masters Women in Sustainability, Environment and Renewable Energy of Innovation, WISER, an initiative that aims to empower and inspire women to be catalysts of innovation and drives the commercial solutions by building the right skills necessary to be leaders of industry, entrepreneurs, and excel in sectors traditionally dominated by men. Beyond borders, we have been assisting other developing countries with various development programs, including renewable energy deployment, totaling close to $1 billion that have helped women improve access to quality education, healthcare, as well as economic opportunities, in addition to improving the environment. Earlier this year, the UAE launched the Climate Project, a 2-year initiative under the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, as well as Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, to share knowledge on coping with climate change, as well as promote financeable climate resilience projects in developing countries. Our goal is to reach 10 million people by 2020 through training programs, social media and communication, thought papers and studies, as well as international campaigns to mobilize climate action. As part of this project, we are prioritizing the engagements and empowerments of women leaders, as we believe that there is a need to increase their access to resources and information, as well as improve their engagements and decision-making and developing innovative approaches, such as the forecast-based financing that can help them to better cope with the onset of climate change. I wish a fruitful exchange of views in these sessions today, as only through collective action could we address the daunting challenges of climate change. I would like to end with a quote from His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the UAE Vice President and Prime Minister of UAE and ruler of Dubai. We do not only empower women, but we empower the whole community through women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's good to have a supportive man, and I see some supportive men in the audience. And now I would like to invite my panelists to come to the stage for discussion on this first panel, Raising Up Women and Girls, Education and Economic Empowerment. And so I welcome the Honourable Mayor Gumede of Durban, South Africa, Bridget Burns, Director of the Women's Environment and Development Organisation. Thank you. Jennifer Morgan, Executive Director of Greenpeace. Good. We have a wealth of experience here today to get some concrete lessons on how we can act on climate and empower women. We know too well that climate change is not gender blind. Women are disproportionately impacted by climate change because of existing socioeconomic inequalities. But we also know that women are fierce agents of change and, with the right support, can do even more to ensure a safe planet for future generations. So let me begin with you, Mayor Gumede, with your first question. You're the first woman mayor of Durban, a city I know quite well. And it's the third largest city in South Africa, a hub for innovation and economic growth. And the city also has the highest concentration of higher education institutions in the country. So can you tell us about the importance of education for girls, particularly in the context of climate change?
Thanks, Mary. My fellow mayors, all women present, our young future women leaders, and all gentlemen supporting us, I greet you all. In my leading capacity as mayor of Durban, South Africa, and my participation in C40, I have recognized the underlying vulnerabilities within the city. At the core of our climate change strategy is the empowerment of our youth to respond to the issues of climate change and the broader environmental sustainability sector. Intensifying youth empowerment has been my consistent message as the mayor of Durban. The city will soon launch the third phase of our climate change partnership with our local university. This partnership has produced master's degrees and PhDs, of which 60% of those were young females. Through our Bremen-Durban partnership, we have launched the Bremen-Durban Marine Environmental Education Network. The program targeted the youth between the ages of 15 and 25. 70% of them are young, brilliant females coming from a very poor background. One of them explained that her mother could not afford the university application fee of $14. The project is aimed at previously disadvantaged youth that has completed their high school. We want for them to become experts in the area of the marine environment and able to inspire others. Through workshops and trainings, these ocean champions will get the tools and skills that will enable them to go out into their communities and inspire others by creating awareness for the ocean. I allow them to sit and observe my political climate change committee meetings. No university graduate has had an opportunity. It is only 7 months and they have developed an ability to interact and question the work of our scientists. In these young women, I see strong environmental lawyers and policymakers. I see scientists that will develop the most practical solutions. I see future leaders who will bring environmental justice and protect their communities at large.
That's very impressive, Mayor. And in particular, letting girls see part of your work, part of how you're making decisions.
It's
I think
important.
That's really good. So briefly, what lessons can other cities learn from your experience and your leadership?
From my experience, other cities must learn that it can't be education only. We must also create leaders in whatever activities that we are doing, because if we stick on education is a priority, of course, but we must also inspire youngsters to be leaders of whatever.
Perfect. Young girls to become leaders as part of their development. I like it. Bridget, climate change impacts and actions to mitigate and adapt are, as we know, gendered. So what are the key elements to ensuring our climate action is gender responsive, including in how solutions are financed?
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today to speak about what is probably unsurprisingly a critically important topic for myself and my organization. And I've been really privileged to work at WeDo for the last decade, which many of you might know stands on the shoulders of our founders, such as US Congresswoman Bella Abzug, Dr. Vandana Shiva, Dr. Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai. And I think when we think about the fact that there's this intersection between women's rights and environment, sometimes we tend to think it's a new topic or a fad, but it's not, of course. It's been something that people have been working on for decades. Indigenous women, frontline grassroots communities have been living and breathing at the front lines of this intersection and making this analysis as to how our current economic system is not only one which Winnie Bayamin aptly said yesterday trashes our planet, but also creates consistent and persistent gender inequalities around the world. And so when I think about the elements for effective climate action, the first thing and the first point for me that's most important to say is recognizing that ensuring women's human rights, including access to education, which we've talked about already, as well as access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, is in and of itself climate action, effective climate action. You know, we have seen evidence from the drawdown report that's been released where investing in women human rights is one of the top solutions to reversing global warming. We have evidence from the Brookings Institute, which shows that when even just 1 year of advancing girls' education actually helps to increase and improve countries' vulnerability to climate disasters. And yet, when we see that, even in spaces like this, there's often a focus not on this element of actually being able to reverse and combat global warming, but a focus on the techno-fix. What's the silver bullet? What's the one solution? When actually for years, we have decades of research showing that investment in women's human rights, education, in girls' health, for example, is part of our challenge and part of how we can actually combat this. I'm pleased to see this on the agenda here, but we really need to stop seeing women and girls' education, women's human rights as sort of an add-on to effective climate action and actually as central to how we combat this challenge. And I also wanted to say, you know, for policymakers, investors, businesses out here who are working on climate solutions, similar to Richard Trumka of the AFL-CIO yesterday, who said, if you're looking at your plans and your policies and you haven't centered gender equality, you haven't ensured that women's human rights are a part of all aspects of your action, go back and start again. Because this is really one of the only ways we're going to be able to combat this challenge. In this country, even though we have women graduating at a higher rate in higher education than men, we still only have, women still only make up 25% of the solar industry. We see similar statistics in Latin America where women only make up 15% of operations and construction in relation to transport, even though they're 50% of the labor force. So we're incapable of having any sort of just transition if we're not analyzing this sexual division of labor and also recentering on the focus on a care economy. Actually, how do we shift that unpaid, unvalued work that predominantly women are doing and create an economy centered on care?
Well, given, as you've said, Bridget, that girls' education is so effective for climate action and it has to be briefly, how can we ensure that women's economic empowerment is part of climate action and very central to the outcomes of this conference?
You know, I think it always starts with the understanding that money is wrapped in power, who has access to it, who's able to use and gain from it. And so when we talk about access to finance and the investments that are being made, we've made progress. I'm happy to say that, you know, all of the major climate finance institutions that exist right now have some sort of gender policy or gender action plan, but that's really been on the backs of champions to push that through, and it hasn't been without pushback. And again, when we go back to all of this evidence that these are where the investments need to be shown, it's really a struggle and a challenge to see those investments being made. We know that I think it's 0.02% of funding from philanthropy is actually going to this intersection of women's rights and environment. So the simple answer is clear. We need to be making these investments that we're not making.
The
we need to understand the solutions. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you very much, Bridget. Jennifer, it's your turn. And as you know, the theme is empowerment of women through climate action. You're the expert on the negotiations at COPs, conferences on climate, the UNFCCC. How can women's leadership in the negotiations help to close the gap on our climate goals for 2020?
Well, I think, 2018, I don't know what you think, Mary, but I feel like we're at a bit of a tipping point
Absolutely.
right now. Because if you think about it, what's happened in the last few months and what's happening at this moment right now with a typhoon bearing down on the north part of the Philippines, and the 10 countries in the EU that were impacted, right? This is something that the urgency is just so, it's so visceral in a way for people around the world. And so I think that these losses that are being felt are much more direct, much more local that are occurring. And these coming months, in a way, can pick that up. So not only the negotiations, I would say, but looking in October, there's going to be the release of the IPCC's 1.5 degrees report. That needs to be our roadmap. I think what we're seeing is that in the newest science, that what people used to think was going to happen at 2 degrees is going to happen at 1.5 and is quite petrifying.
Well, what about women's leadership voices on this?
This is what I wanted to get to. So I think that the complexity of climate change requires a certain kind of leadership. It requires listening. It requires coalition building. It requires courage. It requires speaking truth to power and standing up for those that don't have that power. And I think that women are particularly skilled and adept at that. Therefore, I think that you need more women in leadership. You need that bold action to phase out coal, to keep fossil fuel in the ground. And therefore, the role of women, in a way, I think, is to stand up and bring those coalitions together to build the Paris Agreement, to build the phase-out plans, because the gender action plans that are in there as well, because there's not a lot of time for ego right now. We need to get things done.
And, yeah. And, we began with talking about, women giving leadership at that high level of, ministers and heads of agencies, etc. What about women in the front lines of the climate fight? I mean, how important is their involvement and their voices being heard at things like conferences on climate?
Well, they're fundamental. I mean, and look right here, how important is protest? Right? We need protest. If we didn't have protest, we wouldn't have environmental conferences like this one, right?
Yeah.
So I think, and I think the level of protest, it shows the level of desperation. It shows the level of willingness to be courageous and come in. So frontline, run for office, bring climate change into your debates, go and engage with your local school councils, but be there, be loud. Protest is what we need right now.
Well, can I just press you a little on that? I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think civil society has an incredibly important role in holding governments and holding everybody, holding cities, holding states, holding business to account. We're hearing a lot of words. Are these words going to be action? But I'm also hearing some tension about the fact that this is a conference that's giving some leadership on climate. Why are people protesting? Can you speak to that?
Well, I think, thank you. I think that the protest, in a way, shows the fact that this is not an issue just of the head anymore. This is an issue of the heart. And I think it shows that people are, yes, it's good to have conferences. Yes, it's good to have announcements. But the pace and scale of the change that's required is not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what people want to hear. They need to hear that kind of leadership and that kind of shared leadership. So it's part of our country's history as well. And we need democracy and voices right now in our debate around the world and in the United States.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to both of you as well on this question of urgency and ensuring that one of the outcomes of this conference is that we do see a greater empowerment of women as being important to climate action. So, Mayor, could we begin with you? From an African continent point of view, not just South Africa, I feel that women are becoming very empowered. I'm obviously close to Graça Machel, we're fellow elders, and she's doing a lot on women's empowerment. I've even seen networks of networks linking with each other. Speak a little bit to that for the continent of Africa.
In fact, for us as Africa, it is important because what is most important, our policies are important. where it's being enforced that women must be everywhere. And as South Africans, we are having a policy that says that whatever we are doing in government, in business, schools, church, governing bodies, everywhere, 50-50 of women must be there. Men must be 50 and women must be 50. It's really assist because it takes us to where we want as women. We are
And the African Union Commission gave leadership on that.
Yes.
At a time when there wasn't parity in many bodies, and stuck to that idea of parity, which is very good.
Yes, it's really, that's why today I'm a woman mayor, first of its kind in my very big city, it's a metro, and also I'm the chairperson of my very big organization. So that shows that it's really working if we can look at the issues of policy, because policymakers must be accountable to say that where are women? And now we are drawing in more youth, because we are saying youth must be seen in leadership positions, because it's truth that we are offline very soon. Now we must encourage youth to be in the forefront of whatever we are doing.
Yeah. Bridget, you're a long time as a climate activist, as a women's activist, as a leader. I got a sense of frustration in your voice when you were speaking earlier. Let it out. Let it out.
Yeah, no, I think that it speaks to a lot of what Jennifer actually said as well, that, you know, and I think the frustration is born from a lot of the conversations that we've been having here this week, where I've been in sessions with incredible women leaders who are at the front line, who are putting forward their solutions, whether they're local ecological solutions or household energy solutions, and I have been hearing these for the last decade. They are solutions that need to be invested in, and it's not about necessarily just scale, but diversity of scale. And I think the frustration is still seeing this huge disconnect between that rhetoric and between the solutions that we have that are coming from feminists, from frontline Indigenous voices, and then in spaces where it feels like they're still not, even with all of the evidence being centered in this space, and we're still being asked to sort of prove why we should be invited into that space, as opposed to being centered in it from the beginning. And so I think we're all feeling that sense of urgency, and the only way, and this is a very feminist space, we have to create feminist spaces to have fierce, frank conversations, and we can't be afraid anymore to say when we're not happy with the direction that we're going in, or we feel like people's voices haven't been heard as strong or as loud as they should be.
I knew there was something there that had to come out. Unfortunately, we're up against a timing, and I think we've heard not just urgency and a certain amount of frustration, which needs to be heard, but also important keywords about finance, that money is power, and that only 0.2%, you know, the dribble that gets to women who are actually doing most of the resilience building and work on the ground for women. The importance of capacity building. I loved your idea, Mayor, of having girls become leaders as part of their development. And I think we should think about education of girls as education for leadership, you know, and bringing them into the decision-making of power. I agree very much, Bridget, about feminist spaces, but actually we also need women at the tables that are not yet feminist, that are male-dominated in their body, and we need to hear those voices and be aware that it's only Indigenous women and Indigenous men, but particularly Indigenous women in this context, who can fully explain the value of traditional knowledge, the value of the values, the spiritual values of Indigenous peoples in saving forests, in nurturing the earth, and being in harmony with the earth, and being coherent about it. And if we don't have those voices at the table, then we're not understanding. And I had that frustration as well. You had delegates who live in cities and go to too many conferences and talk a jargon, and it just doesn't make that kind of sense.
Mary, can I assist on that one? Because through the experience that I had as the mayor of Durban, it is important for the environmental officers to understand the issue of a layperson, not understand the importance of this issue. Hence, on my side as the mayor, I was assisted by my technocrats. That's why I understand more, because really sometimes people do things, not understanding that these things are wrong. And also, we must learn more because we need these indigenous women and youth for them to understand what is an issue. And you cannot touch me now, but the woman behind is a youngster, but she's a scientist. She's the one who have been making sure that I understand everything.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. Okay, a last word, very briefly, from the three of you.
My last word for us as women occupying the leadership space, let us not only accommodate our young women to be the contributors, but let us allow them to lead in the decisions that will shape the future generations. Let us bring transformation that will send a powerful message about leadership under women and set the tone, the paradigm shift in leadership, as well to pave a way for our future women leaders. Let us leave no one behind. That's my very important message. I'm excited about this program because it does not focus on providing bursary like it is traditionally done. It's allowing them to identify and choose their careers path through real-time experience with the municipality day-to-day operations. We could have easily lost these brilliant minds to drugs or crime, even suicide. Let us broaden the opportunities and invest in these young women because resilient communities will build from them. With those viewers, I just want to say young women can lead us in future.
Good. I'm glad you're emphasizing the voice of youth in this context. And leaving no one behind means prioritizing the furthest behind first.
Exactly.
We still haven't got quite to that practice in every part of development, prioritizing the
Even a
furthest
lay
behind first.
person there in the informal settlement.
Yeah, Bridget, you can see the clock there. We're
Yes.
running out of time.
We are.
Briefly.
I just want us to really carry this and ride this tide of resistance and understand that now, more than ever, is a moment for, in particular, women leaders to step up, to speak out from a feminist perspective, ensuring that the voices of grassroots and indigenous women are at the front of decision-making in these spaces, letting them lead those conversations, sharing power where we have those spaces to do so, and really saying enough is enough on this issue. We know that this is where the solution is. It is this investment in women human rights. It is ensuring that they're a central part of all climate action, and it's making sure that their solutions are the ones being highlighted and invested in, and just making that our call from this session forward into the next COPs and all of the UN meetings that we're in. We don't lose that spirit. I think it's really
good. Jennifer?
Yeah, I also just want to talk a little bit about, very quickly, the empowerment of young girls and women, and to equivalate the power shift that we need to happen on climate change away from centralized corporate patriarchal types of systems, and the power shift that is happening around the world with the Me Too and Time's Up movement. I think that women are a big part of this solution and need to be more in leadership roles. And I hope that the movement that's happening around the world with Me Too and Time's Up can empower women to also take up the climate change activism and to get the funding, to get that to be a central piece, and for people to understand that we need women leaders now with the skills that women bring to solve this problem.
Yeah, excellent. Please cheer this wonderful panel for their... Thank you all. Thank you, three of you, very much indeed. And, we're making a good start, a very good start. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I now have great pleasure in introducing a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Laura Stachel, co-founder and executive director of We Care Solar, who's going to tell us about the transformative effect of access to energy that it has on women's empowerment pathway. Laura, please.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for the slides to change. There's no slide up yet. So I'm going to take you on a journey that I started on about 10 years ago.
Oh, I see.
I want you to imagine for a moment that you're not here in San Francisco. I'm sorry, the slides are not responding. Sorry about this. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you are one of the 15 million women this year who suffer a complication during pregnancy or childbirth. And you're not here in San Francisco, but in a small village in northern Nigeria. And even though you haven't had prenatal care, After 2 days of labor, you realize something is wrong. Your family pulls together the resources to bring you to, sorry, this is a little bit out of sync. They pull together the resources to bring you to the nearest hospital where a midwife ushers you in. She tries to understand why you're bleeding so heavily, tries to understand why, who she can get to perform the life-saving surgery for you, tries to understand if your baby is still alive, and the only light available was the light you saw on the last slide, which is a kerosene lantern. This is the grim reality for millions of women around the world. Part of the reason why women like those that you just saw experience a 1 in 38 chance of dying during pregnancy and childbirth during their lifetime. Why are so many women dying? Well, part of the reason is that they're impoverished and they don't have good access to care, but part of the reason lies in the health facilities themselves, where even when women arrive expecting to get care, they may be unable to get the life-saving care they need. So in 2008, I was asked to do a study to understand why, at that time, 500,000 women were dying in childbirth, and I spent most of my time in labor and delivery. Nothing that you would experience like here, but perhaps you saw the slide a moment ago that showed just a pretty destitute room. And on top of the fact that they didn't have a lot of supplies, they didn't have electricity. So without electricity, they relied on generators, which were only sporadically working, fossil fuel sources of light like candles and kerosene lanterns. What did it mean not to have electricity? It meant that surgeons were conducting surgeries by the ambient light of windows. It meant that when someone needed a blood transfusion, they could wait hours or days to find a suitable blood donor because there was no refrigeration. And it meant that babies like these were being born into near darkness and smoke-filled room in air that was illuminated by kerosene lanterns or candles. What I saw stunned me, and I went to speak about it with my husband, who was a solar innovator. Hal Aronson came up with a solution, solar electricity for the hospital. And what he did was to build a portable prototype that I could take with me on one of my visits to show my Nigerian colleagues. They loved it, and they asked me to bring more. And we began to create solar electric kits called solar suitcases that I would deliver on each of my visits. Well, demand grew not just in Nigeria, but from people around the world. We were first building these in our home and then our backyard. And as the requests came in, we ended up improving the design and bringing them to producing them in a factory where now they are producing hundreds of these at a time. So with the solar suitcase, midwives now have the light that they need to be able to see through the night. They're able to charge cell phones so they can call for emergency help at night. They're able to conduct surgeries through the night. Procedures are no longer being canceled or postponed. Babies are being resuscitated and lives are being saved. But technology alone isn't enough. We needed a way to educate the health workers who would use these. So we first leaned on the midwives themselves, asking if they could become trainers. And soon they watched the solar installations and they said, can't we do that as well? So we got them on the roof, and they inspired us to build a brigade of women solar installers, women who go around the world working with our partners, leading train the trainer workshops, so that we've now trained more than 13,000 health workers in solar electricity. We partner with UN agencies, ministries of health, and international NGOs to be able to reach these health centers. And using this model, we have now brought clean energy to 3,500 health centers in 10 countries, serving 1.8 million women and their newborns. We created a movement that is called Light Every Birth. We're calling upon all nations to ensure that clean energy is available for childbirth. And we have an ambitious goal. We want to reach 100,000 health centers by 2030. Our vision is a world where every woman survives childbirth, where newborns can survive infancy, where children can thrive, and where communities can have clean air to breathe. We're trying to show that what's good for the health of people is good for the health of our planet. No woman should die giving life. We've shown that it's possible to bring clean, distributed energy and replace fossil fuels in some of the most remote health centers around the world. We have ambitious goals, and we invite any of you who would like to join us to come help us to light every birth. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce you to our next moderator, Nancy Fund. She's founder and managing partner of Double Bottom Line Partners. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to all the organizers of this fantastic event. We're talking about the role of non-state entities today and the role of women in investing and accomplishing improvements in climate. On a personal note, while I've been an investor for decades, I want to let you know that one of my first jobs out of college, I worked for Governor Brown when he was the governor for the first time, and he created an agency called the Office of Appropriate Technology that back then studied unheard of technologies like solar and wind and energy efficiency. And that had a pretty meaningful influence on my life, even though I moved into the private sector. Because when we founded DBL, which our firm, a venture capital firm, it really was based on technology, investing in technology that helped the planet and helped people rather than just for its own sake. So I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Governor Brown over the years. So we have been able to move the needle on investing in climate change with investments like Tesla and SolarCity, also health and nutrition, Revolution Foods. We have a long list of investments, and we've pioneered an approach that really says when you invest, you should bring together profit and purpose. You should bring together money and meaning. You should derive financial returns that also accomplish significant social, economic, and environmental progress. And so it's been a privilege to help build this field. And when it comes to women and climate, there are really two sides of that equation in terms of empowering women. There's the empowering women to invest in and work on climate change. And then there's also the issue that women are disproportionately negatively affected by climate change. And so on the first dimension, I have some good news. Our firm is women-founded. We have senior women in positions of leadership. And while the national average for how many venture-backed companies is a pitiful 4%, in our firm, because we do have women, we're at about 64% of our companies have women in their founding teams or management teams. So, thank you. It can be done, and it really just takes intentionality and working hard at it. Now, on the other, and by the way, these are companies that have tens of thousands of employees. Some of them are going to be listed on the stock exchange. So these are, really significant players that will move the needle and are already. On the second part, the fact that women are disproportionately affected by the negative trends within climate, we have helped create the EV and the solar industry in this country, and we said we've got to do more. We've got to take these learnings and address bigger problems and opportunities. And so let me just tell you a couple of factoids about Nigeria. It's Africa's most populous country, its biggest economy. Its population is tipped to reach 400 million in a few decades, which will make it larger than the United States. And yet only 45% of households have electricity. And people, there are 100 million Nigerians that use diesel generators to shore up a fragile electric grid. And those diesel generators produce some 28 million metric tons of carbon a year, and that's the equivalent of over 6 million cars on the road. So it's a huge problem. You can't grow a nation this large and rely on that kind of a system. And it's women that bear the effects of energy poverty because of the role they play in cooking and household maintenance, and they suffer the most from the respiratory diseases that come with a patchwork quilt involving diesel generators like this. So we had invested in a company called Off Grid Electric, which just changed its name to Zola Electric, and it brings the pay-as-you-go model of solar and storage and efficient appliances to countries in Africa. And we've gone into Tanzania, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and we have over 180,000 customers and or households or businesses and 1 million customers. So we're really building a new model there. And so our pledge that we developed, Zola Electric and DBL, for this conference is to bring that, solar and storage and distributed energy appliances to Nigeria to really solve this problem of relying on diesel generators to allow Nigerians to benefit from affordable distributed clean energy. And so our goal is to provide 1 million homes and businesses in Nigeria with this clean solar and storage energy over the next 3 years. And what we hope is that this will help drive the African continent, its people, its women, its children, to a clean energy future without the negative health effects that they've been experiencing. So that's our pledge. So, thank you. So with that, we're going to delve into some of these issues around women and investing and clean energy. And so I would like to welcome my 2 panelists to the stage. Dawn Lippert, who is with the leader of the Elemental Accelerator, and Bill Bean, who is with Signify, which used to be called Philips Lighting. And so we're going to have a good discussion here.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to start with you, Dawn. I've had the privilege to work with Dawn for several years, and she's just a rock star. Tell us about the intersection of service and investment that you have accomplished with the Elemental Accelerator, and what your role is in moving the initiatives forward relating to climate change.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Nancy. So it's a pleasure to be here. I think what is important from the Elemental Accelerator perspective is that we're a nonprofit. We, in some ways, act a little bit like a VC, but we have 2 distinct things that we do as a nonprofit. One is an accelerator, where we're finding startups, usually about 15 to 20 startups a year that can be really highly impactful, and then we're funding them to do projects in actual communities. So we're saying, these are technologies that are really important, and we want to focus on deployment of that innovation within communities. I can go into a little bit of how we do that and what it looks like. And then on the second side, it's really about a community change organization. And one of the things we realized when we started deploying projects in communities was that the barriers to deployment are all local. So it's about permitting, it's about workforce, it's about all these different issues that your companies see in the jurisdictions they work in also. So we're based in Hawaii. We also have offices in California, and we're working extensively in the Asia Pacific. But as we started in Hawaii and using Hawaii as a lab for innovation, we started to see these different barriers in permitting and policy. So we have an entire community change organization that is focused on breaking down those barriers one at a time and helping entrepreneurs scale. So I'll just give a couple examples about things we've learned as we've done this work. And the first is, it was actually really fun to hear a 64% number. We're getting close for about 60% of our founding teams have women in them. And what we've seen is inclusivity in those teams really matters. It actually makes the teams much stronger, and teams with high levels of diversity and also high levels of empathy score higher on productivity. So that's something we've seen firsthand in our companies. And then at the intersection of policy and innovation, one of the things that we're doing is finding areas where there's new technologies, and policy generally lags a little bit behind innovation. That's to be expected. But one of the things we're doing is seeing if we can close that gap, particularly at the local level. So an example is working with a battery company. We have a company called STEM, which does distributed batteries. And we had a real permitting issue. It was taking about 18 months to permit these new batteries because most local permitting departments had never seen this before. They were nervous about putting batteries behind the meter in different commercial buildings. And so by bringing industry together, working at the local level, we were able to shrink that. We're now down to a couple of months per installation. and trying to build a collaboration among the policy folks and industry so that people aren't frustrated and everyone's getting things done faster.
Fantastic. We'll come back to some of those issues around the intersection of policy and investing a little later. Right now, I'd like to talk with Bill and welcome.
Thank you.
Signify, formerly known as Philips Lighting, is an excellent example of how non-state actors, businesses, can drive climate action forward. What has Signify pledged to do in the lead up to 2020, and how does the company's commitment promote and improve the economic success of women, in your view?
Thank you, Nancy. So I'll address this in 2 parts. First, answering the question about Signify and what we do, and then why women are important. So we've been in the lighting business for over 120 years, and for the past over 10 years, we've been committed to solar lighting. Why? Because there's 1.2 billion people in the world that don't have electricity. And we have found by giving them solar lighting, or more importantly, creating a business that's at the base of the pyramid, it's sustainable, it improves their life. So what we see with the Global Off-Grid Alliance, over 50% of the people who receive off-grid lighting say their economic activity boosts by 3 to 4 hours a day. 91% say they have better quality of air. This matters to us because we believe that technology and people can actually arrest climate change. This comes from the top. We're committed by 2020 as a company to be 100% carbon neutral. We only have 40% to go. We're committed to having 80% of our products more sustainable than any other product in our industry. We're at 78% now. We're committed to 100% clean landfill. We're making good progress on that. So this is part of our commitment in the over 60 countries that we participate in. Now, with women, why do we care about that? Well, personally, myself, I know it seems strange to see a guy in a suit making this statement, but if I go back to myself, I grew up on a small farm in Ohio. My dad was a traveling salesman. My mom managed the farm. She taught me how to run the tractor. She taught me how to fix it. She taught me how to raise the livestock. And I saw that women are excellent managers and leaders from age 6 until 18 when I left the farm. We see the same thing in the 30 projects that were involved globally to deliver solar lighting. 5 years ago when we did solar lighting projects, we were so proud about 100 solar lighting communities that we did in Africa. What we found, though, is after the projects were built, within 3 to 4 years, either they broke or the parts were stolen. So we changed our approach. Rather than building things ourselves, we are working with local institutions, primarily run by women, because they last. They're leaders. So whether it's in Rajasthan, where we work with groups like Frontier Markets for product development, delivering solar lamps and lanterns to communities there with people like Ajeta, who runs that organization, or Sunita, who does the last mile sales for this, or Aniri in Uganda, who provides microfinance, or Grace, who does the support, which is so critical. What we have found is that by having women front and center, and they're about 80% of our entrepreneurs, 80% of the salespeople of the groups we work with, and over 43% of the management of these projects, and we want to get that better. We have found a new formula that enables us to have the projects last and be meaningful to the local communities. So to answer your question, we're very committed to combating climate change, and we think the secret of this is actually really empowering women, and we continue to do this.
Fantastic. So you've mentioned some of the ways that in your own business you were able to improve performance by relying on women. Because we're not surprised about that. What are some of the other ways that businesses can take up the important task of moving the needle on climate?
I think it's a great question. I think you have to make it a heart of your business. So we totally took our purpose and rewrote it. So our commitment that every employee knows and we follow is to unlock the extraordinary power of light to brighten lives and better the world. What that means to us is in that product design, we have a commitment of 80% of our products need to be more sustainable, energy efficient by 10%. They're measured against that, as well as providing sustainable benefits to employees. We've changed our management bonus structure. So we have a sustainability target that we have to achieve to get a full bonus payout. We celebrate success with the employees by having local sustainability and also corporate social responsibility champions. We give employees a day off a year to go work in their local communities to educate people about energy efficiency. We've committed to lighting up through solar lighting 100 schools. We have 20 so far. I was just in one in Jaipur, looking at and last year in one in Morocco, looking at the fact that we've given primarily female girls' schools 3 more hours a day to study, and they're so excited about it, and greater security. So to sum it up, we have a corporate structure that we follow ourselves with goals that we measure every quarter to see if we're achieving it or not. We make it matter by tying it to our own pay. And then we do meaningful projects through product design all the way to delivery by our local employees that excite them and make them own this. And that motivates us all to do better.
Fantastic, really great ideas. I was struck by the fact that it was your mom that taught you how to drive a tractor.
And also how to fix it. My dad was very surprised when he came home one day and she's reassembling the engine. She was brilliant, still is.
Very, very cool. We have a company that I was at yesterday down in San Carlos called Farmers Business Network that's
it's a great business.
Bringing data, millions of acres of data, crunching it and helping farmers make better decisions and discover that they're paying too much for their seeds because their neighbor got the same thing for 30% less. It's been not at all a transparent market, and that's partly the reason that farmers are challenged. And so this is a company that's really empowering and helping farmers make more money. But the CFO of the company, a woman named Maria Olide, she was born in Mexico, moved with her parents to Salinas, and they were farmers. They were working the lettuce fields, and she was one of the first in her family to go to college. She ended up then also going to Stanford Business School. She worked in accounting, and she worked for a public company. And when she found out about Farmers Business Network, she was like, I have to work at this company. And so now she's the CFO. She's helping on the other side, from the business side, the farming culture that she grew up with. And yesterday we had kind of a long meeting about various things, and I saw her team around her, and it was all women. And then before I left, because I'm on the compensation committee, they took me aside and said, we're doing a huge study on pay equity, and we want to make sure that we are completely fair and equal. And this is it's going to be a big company. It's growing fast, but this is not a Fortune 500 company that has huge resources to address these issues, and yet it was front and center. And it's the same with your 60%, with our 64%. When women are in positions of leadership, they kick ass, and a lot of good things happen. So I'd like to...
Perfect summary.
So turning to Dawn and your role in women's leadership and pulling together this very creative, very effective accelerator that you've been able to build, what advice would you give to young women out there that want to make a difference in climate, that want that private sector or not-for-profit approach, and why is prioritizing women's leadership in the renewable energy or related clean energy sectors, why is that so crucial in climate action in your view?
Well, I think you really touched on it earlier. I mean, we see it from two perspectives. So we call it kind of equity in, which is what's happening inside the company and how you're thinking about recruitment, how you're thinking about advancement for diverse positions, not just women, but people from all kinds of backgrounds within a company. And then also equity out, like what are you doing to address sort of structural disparities in climate and in energy technologies and technology access in general across the market. So I think on the first side, on equity in, I mean, we still are searching for women founders, and they are few and far between. So I think my advice is that there's, we're still relatively small in terms of numbers on the VC and investor side, but increasingly there is a lot of awareness about this. So I encourage women I meet, particularly engineers or technical women, to consider starting their own company and team up with others to do that, because I think we're missing a lot of talent who's sitting on the sidelines and not taking that risk and taking that leap to start their own company. So that's sort of one piece of it. On the equity outside, what's really interesting is this year we decided to really focus on this. So we launched what we call the Equity and Access track. So typically we've been funding about 12 to 15 companies a year. We have a portfolio of 63 companies across energy, transportation, agriculture, and water. And this year we also opened up a specific equity and access track and said to companies all over the world, we want to know what you guys can do to address underserved communities. And this is not just because we're altruistic, which we are, but it's also because in Hawaii, for example, asset limited and income constrained households make up 49% of the population. In the United States, low income households make up about 40% of the population. So if you're not addressing these kinds of communities, you're really leaving a huge market opportunity on the table. So we wanted to see what companies were doing in this space. And this is the first year we launched it. We talked about 800 companies a year that come through the pipeline for the accelerator. And 40% of them expressed interest in the equity and access track and said they actually wanted to address this issue, which was really interesting for us. I mean, we're always looking for product market fit. We're an evolving and learning organization, just like any startup. And so to see that there was real market demand for entrepreneurs that want to address this issue is pretty interesting to us. We're going to be selecting 20 companies this year, so our largest group ever, and 7 of those are specifically in equity and access. And we're going to be starting that program here in California and working with companies sort of across a number of different neighborhoods and areas that have been left behind. And we like to talk about it as islands. I mean, in Hawaii, we're used to geographic islands, but in California, there's real islands of economic opportunity. And so those are some of the areas where we're focusing for equity and access. And just one quick point of that, I love your story about Farmers Business Network. One of our companies, Ceres Imaging, is also in the agriculture space. And one of their really early employees and founders, Jenna Rodriguez, she's also from the Central Valley. And she is a scientist and kind of got her degree. And when she found out what this company was doing, she said the same thing, I want to join this company. And she's now held almost every role at the company as they've grown. And she's helped develop each of the different departments or sort of work streams within the company and been incredibly effective because she actually comes from that community. So I think whatever, whether it's women or men or sort of different kinds of backgrounds, actually bringing in diverse backgrounds into the company has been a huge competitive advantage for this company in particular, working across the agriculture space.
Very, very exciting. So getting at that, you talk about addressing the lower income homes or apartments, housing with renewable energy. I remember in the early days of the solar industry here with Solar City that the Public Utilities Commission in California came out with the California Solar Initiative that provided rebates to homeowners to go solar. And it was really one of the main reasons why we now have 1 million solar rooftops in this state. It was a very successful policy to spur the development. But what they did is they gave an extra rebate for multifamily low-income housing for a small percentage of the program. And what was so interesting was that it was called MASH. The MASH project was snapped up within, I would say, a few months by the commercial players, the Sunruns and the Solar Cities, the SunPowers and such, because they all wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to supply solar to lower income multifamily housing, but those people could not afford it without this extra rebate. And so it was a terrific example of how policy is kind of required to go into some of these underserved populations and make a difference. And so it's always struck me that why didn't we just do more of that? So how do you see the role of policy in helping accomplish these goals?
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. I mean, this has been a fascinating week for policy in California. As you guys, Governor Brown signed the SB 100 and made a 100% goal for California for 2045. Hawaii's had that for about 3 years, so welcome to the party. But it's been great, actually, because I think that the collaboration across Hawaii and California has been really strong. And we had on Tuesday a gathering of some of the highest level officials from California and Hawaii who've been working on both the 100% goal and then here in California on the cap and trade and sort of carbon tax and how those proceeds are used. And so we had this sort of really intense dialogue between policy leaders in both jurisdictions to get at what are the lessons that we've learned in Hawaii from our 100% goal and really driving toward 100%. The key lesson that we've learned is that 2045 is way too slow. And so we've done a lot of different analysis. We published a report called Transcending Oil earlier this year that shows that under most conceivable future prices of fossil fuels, you actually would want to go to 100% clean energy in Hawaii by 2030. It's partly because we burn oil for power, so it's really expensive. But the 2045 is an extra 15 years of paying for oil and fossil fuels that you actually don't need if you're really aggressive, and just following the economics. So there's lots of technical things you need to do to make that happen, but economically you should go much faster than we are right now. So that's kind of what we learned on the SB 100. But on the California side, one of the key pieces that people in Hawaii are really interested in is California set aside 35% of the cap and trade proceeds to go to disadvantaged communities as laid out by the Cal Enviro screen, which looks at a lot of different indicators of poverty and pollution around the state. And of that, so they've collected about $8 billion of funding, I think, as of this year. And so 35% of that has gone to specific transportation projects, emissions-reducing projects, pollution-reducing projects in those communities. And the question, and we sort of see this as a huge success, as a way that Senator De Leon and these guys have actually been able to really dedicate resources to these communities. And the question that our city councilman from Hawaii asked is, well, why not 100%? So it's really interesting, sort of to your question. I think people are starting to figure out, I mean, these communities have been really disproportionately affected. And so what does that equity policy play actually look like? And I think it's a pretty open question and a pretty exciting place for people to get involved.
Yeah, I've always, we have a company called Revolution Foods that serves healthy lunches to low-income schools.
That's good, very good.
Thank you. And I've always wondered why there isn't the equivalent of the free and reduced lunch program that allows low-income children to get a lunch for free. That's a federal program. Why we don't just create that for low-income residences so that it just across the board you have access to affordable clean energy. So if I were running for office, that's what I would do.
Sounds like maybe you should.
I'm going to leave that to the experts. But
Okay.
I'm really fascinated by when you said what Signify is doing. You didn't mention 100% renewables. You mentioned carbon neutrality,
Right.
which is a facet of the governor's announcement earlier. Beyond the electricity sector, he's calling for carbon neutrality across the whole state.
Right.
And so tell us about the nuances of that.
Sure. So I will do that and also try to answer the other question, which is we believe that the extra alternative fuel, we're big fans of solar and also solar and wind, and actually we have wind farms that we've have leases on in Texas that we use, and we're also moving to have the United States 100% renewable as soon as possible this year or next for our operations. But we believe total carbon neutrality is the ultimate goal because energy efficiency is a fundamental part of this solution. You can't just go to renewables in our belief and in our experience and win. Because what we see is that buildings account for anywhere from 40 to 60% of the energy consumption. And we believe that buildings need to become much more efficient. And that needs to be done quickly because energy consumption, while we talk, is increasing in most countries 2 to 3% per year. So we have to stop talking. We have to make our buildings and our livelihoods and our places that we work and live more energy efficient. So this is what we strive for, and this is how we're going to achieve it ourselves by 2020. Through reducing our own energy consumption in our factories and also in how we do air freight, but we strive and we encourage everyone else to do that. So we have additional goals for ourselves, which is by 2030, in addition, once we hit carbon neutrality in 2020, then we're going to move to making all of our fleet and our buildings carbon neutral by 2030. We think everybody else needs to do the same. We also think it needs to be integrated. So what we just released with the Rocky Mountain Institute yesterday was a policy paper on the idea that by making your buildings more energy efficient, you can actually create repositories of electricity that can be used for electrical vehicles. Electrical vehicles are fantastic, but we have to make sure that we're not creating an excess energy pool that comes from fossil fuel burning plants. Buildings can be the batteries. And so that's where we'd like to take this. So we try to think on an integrated, action-oriented side, and I think that's necessary because climate change is not a linear model. right? It could actually go much faster than we expect. So policy has to be fast.
Well, and technology moves fast too. And one thing that in developing this pledge for Nigeria, Zola didn't want leftover technology being used. They wanted like state of the art, and that's why that's where kind of marrying Silicon Valley to far places, be that Hawaii or the Pacific Islands, makes a big difference, because what happens is that now inverter technology has improved, the use of software to kind of real-time energy management, and it's cheaper. It's cheaper, better, faster. And so what we're going to pilot in Nigeria is a system whereby you can self-assemble a grid, even just by pulling together all of the solar and storage in a neighborhood, or you can create an island within your apartment of your solar and storage. And then when the grid is operable, just go back and forth seamlessly. And those of you that have been in this field, you know that that's kind of a no-no. Historically, there's all kinds of problems that happen when if you don't island and prevent, if you can't just turn on and off the grid without some dire consequences. So the technical improvements, I think it's just so ironic that it's Africa where this is being piloted. I mean, it's like before Sacramento, it's Senegal, or it's Ghana, or now Nigeria, and some of that is because, from a policy perspective, they don't have this incumbent system, so they're just kind of jumping right in and leapfrogging. And so,
if I may, we've also purposely placed our solar lighting business in India. Yeah. For that reason, because that's where the demand is initially, and also that's where great engineers are. We just put out 10,000 luminaires, streetlights, for those in the United States, that are completely powered by solar and batteries. We're jumping from that to what we call hybrid batteries, which basically store the electricity for when the grid goes down or at night, so then we can self-power out. And if the grid's fine, then we don't use it. They can keep it for additional or power other things, but if the grid's down, then they can use it as well.
Yeah, and I think one other example of that that's been really interesting for us in Hawaii is that one of the challenges in Hawaii is that we have so much solar on the grid that our daytime minimum for the load is below what it is at night. Mm-hmm. And so this creates huge technical challenges, and if we want to put more and more solar on the grid, we have to figure out ways to balance that. And the last thing you want is a really peaky grid. It's really expensive to maintain and operate. So on one of the islands on Molokai, we have a project going on because they had hit this same exact challenge. And the island's very small, so it's similar to like sort of almost a village size. It's about a 10 megawatt grid, and their nighttime minimum is at just about 1.5 megawatts. So it's kind of like a medium-sized hotel or something. It's relatively small. So we have a company that puts they're called Connector, and they put a collar around the meter for solar and enable you to remotely monitor and then actually control the solar on the grid. And this can be a really scary concept because people who want solar often really want the independence of being sort of independent from the grid. So they don't necessarily want the utility to be able to turn on and off their solar. So when we rolled this out, and there were about 80 customers waiting to put solar on the grid, they've been waiting about 3 years to do this. And we rolled it out on Molokai and looked at what would actually happen. And when we looked at it, it turned out that you only had to manage or sort of control that solar about 3% of the year to give all of those customers access to the grid. So that really sort of addressed the fear question around how do you implement these technologies in a way that kind of works for everyone. So if you can use relatively inexpensive technologies that take advantage of digital solutions and new communications technologies, then we can get more solar on the grid and really reduce the carbon footprint while also enabling people more access. And the trickiest part, actually, of this project is the fact that on Molokai and in many of these remote areas, there's terrible cell phone access. And so as you're actually trying to do sort of digitization and communications, you need this to follow sort of cell phone and broadband and data networks as well. So these problems all actually come hand in hand. I'm sure you've seen this across the projects that you work in. And so this is another area, I think, where policy needs to be a much better bridge. Most people who are interested in energy policy really don't get involved in like broadband policy or data, but it's actually really critical.
Very, very important. So we don't have much time left. I'm just going to summarize some of the key themes, and then I'm going to ask you guys a final question. So just be thinking. So just some of the themes that have come up through our discussion, certainly the importance of women in decision-making positions and the ability to move the needle relating to ratios of women in clean energy, the 64%, the 60% versus the 4% average. That is a key takeaway. The relationship between investing in climate improvement and investing in policy and bringing those worlds together. We've had some really good dialogues about that and examples. From Bill, the role of businesses in not just promoting the lighting and the solar and wind, but to establish the concept of carbon neutrality and develop that over a multi-year period. I think that's super important, and of course the role of energy efficiency. I think sort of the go local or go home was a theme here. You know, rely on the wisdom, the energy, the aspirations of the people in these places around the world, rather than imposing, you know, a model that might have worked here. The best is when you can cross-pollinate, of course. And then back to the issue of women. It's not enough to have the women in place, but to drive the stories that you were able to tell, to drive recruiting, to drive you know, analysis of pay equity. But all of this gets a lot easier when you have a more diverse leadership team and a more diverse workplace. So. And then the final takeaway is the role very exciting, the role that the developing world is playing in hatching the next generation of clean energy technologies. I'm not sure I would have predicted that 10 years ago, and I think it's fabulous because it really does bring our world together and empowers so many women along the way as we see an end to the disproportionate ill effect of women and climate change. So my final question for you guys, we have about 5 seconds, is when do you think we'll see kind of equal numbers of men and women driving climate change and putting at the forefront a distributed, carbon neutral, clean energy world? How long will it take?
I can't speak for the world, I can speak for what we're doing. So by 2020, we plan to improve 5 million lives by bringing solar and train 5,000 entrepreneurs in the field who will do this. We expect 80% of those entrepreneurs will be women. That's what we're seeing right now, and we're going to continue that.
Awesome. 50-50. I guess my answer would be that I actually think that we have just as many women as men. I think we're actually pretty equal in this. I think that what we're missing is women in leadership roles around it, and also women in sort of recognition roles. But I think actually when you look across sort of like nonprofit, policy, for-profit sectors, we have women doing incredible things, and we need to lift up what they're doing and give them more responsibility and shine the light on that.
All right, well, with that inspiring finale, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and let's go get it done. Thanks.
Thanks.
And we're not done yet, of course, because I have the pleasure and honor to introduce a woman who played a pivotal role in the Paris Climate Agreement, Ségolène Royal, the former president of COP21, and at the time the Minister for the Environment, Energy and the Sea in the government of France. Of course, she's still a minister, and she's going to speak to us about women in leadership. Ségolène, vous avez la parole.
Good morning to all of you. Dear Mary, I would like first to thank warmly Governor Jerry Brown and Special Envoy for Climate Michael Bloomberg for organizing this crucial summit. I would say the summit of willingness 2 months before COP24 and at a turning point when at the same time some national governments, especially here, weaken their commitments. Dear Mary Robinson, we brought together hundreds of women during COP21, and I was in charge of the action agenda in Paris on December the 8th, 2015, including Winnie Byanyima, Vandana Shiva, and many others. I would like to pay tribute again to the work of Mary Robinson and your remarkable, particularly in the framework on her foundation. Women are the main victims of climate change, but they are the key part of the solution. The climate battle cannot be won without women, and it is now obvious. But women have for a long time been forgotten in the climate negotiations. And before 1992, the UNFCCC, the Convention of Climate Change, did not recognize equality between sexes. And the first time the importance of integration genders was put on the table was the Beijing Declaration in an action plan in 1995. I was there with some of you, and we can remember Hillary Clinton doing one of her first public statements. And it is only in 2001 that the first step was taken during COP7. The parties adopted their two decisions concerning gender equality and participation of women. But it took 14 years between COP7, 2001, and COP21, 2015, to give women their rightful place. Finally, in the Paris Agreement, we, women, are included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, but only at the last moment. And as a feminist and as a minister, I joined my efforts with those NGOs to get this. It was not easy, but at the end, women appear not only in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, but they are mentioned 5 times in the agreement. But we can regret, and we did, that women are not appear in the operational articles, particularly they are not in the financial articles. That is why we must remain vigilant. And it is regrettable too that out of 180 head of states, less than 10 are women, and this explaining this. Let me give you 4 facts very quickly, among many others, to demonstrate the vulnerability of women. First, as you know, women are spending 40 billion of free work a year in Africa to fetch water and wood further and further away because of the dryness and deforestation. 2, the farmer in Africa is first and foremost a woman farmer who produced 80% of the food but owns only 10% of the land and 3% only of the bank loans. 3, women are the most affected by climate disaster. 70% of the victims of the devastating 2004 Asian tsunami were women. Why? Because they cannot swim or climb to the trees, because they are protecting their children and old persons before themselves. And they are also very little associated with alert programs. And 4, among climate refugees and victims of forced displacement, women are vulnerable. Sexual assault, trafficking in women, forced prostitution. So that is why this differentiated impact must be taken into account in all climate policies. Now, why are women the key part of the solution? Women are combative, inventive, creative, and they only want to act. They represent a tremendous energy to encourage. Women have in charge the day-to-day problems of survival, hunger, and thirst for their family, so they know the services provided by nature. And Wangari Maathai said, when you attack nature, women are the first to smell the danger. Water management, slow burning fireplace, solar ovens. We know that local energies are one of the major keys of the solution, and women are in the center of the local solutions. That's why I'm working for that with my new foundation, Dea Planet. And we know also that if women had equal access to means of production, they would increase their agricultural production by 20 or 30% and could feed 150 million more people immediately. So an essential part of the solution to fight climate change effectively and every day, women's access to education, training, green technology, technical studies, agronomy, and reserved funding. And to end, what kind of proposals? I wrote a report for the United Nations with plenty of women I met in several countries during 1 year as president of COP21 with several proposals. For example, we must do that 100% of national contribution must integrate the gender dimension. And currently, only 36% of contributions submitted by states integrate the gender dimension. It's not enough. 2, dedicate half of the resources devoted to decentralized energy production to projects built by women as part of the 100 billion decided at COP21. 3, created agricultural schools for women with programs integrating renewable energy. 4, in the early warning system with a cruise program provide for equal funding. Half of the action must be financed for women. And to end, I would like to dedicate the beautiful thoughts dedicated to the great Wangari Maathai. And during COP21, I have given her name to the main room of the COP21. And as you know, she called for getting rid of our fear to give hope to others. That is why we are here. We, women and men, we must continue the fight, not only for us, but because we are more than half of the sky for humanity on this sick planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ségolène. Thank you both for your kind words and for your continued leadership. So, I hope that we've all learned something here today. And I know I certainly have a sense that sharing our lived experience of women's leadership has emboldened us to be even more aware of the need for gender-responsive climate action. I hope we're all fired up, are we? All fired up. And one of the first events I attended as part of the Global Action, Climate Action Summit was the WeCan organized Women's Assembly for Climate Justice. I must say it was probably the most representative event that I've attended, in the sense that women from several cultures were gathered to share their experiences of rising and fighting for climate action. I pledged to them that I would use my platform here at the summit to underscore the need to include women, particularly those on the front lines of climate change, in the commitments and pledges that emerge from this summit. I said that where I could, I would share my seat so that another woman with lived experience of climate change could share her expertise here and in future discussions. So I'm going to take a moment, and it has to be a moment because we're running out of time, to get Agnes Lena, a Maasai from Kenya, to come up here beside me and help us close this out. Come on, Agnes, up you come. Can you get up here? Ooh! You have.
Thank you so much.
You have 1 minute.
This is a surprise. I didn't expect this. But I just want to say thank you so much, Mary Robinson. I am so humbled to be here. Many times now, I think the 3rd time now, to represent my community, to represent the pastoralist women from the village where I come from, to talk, to be their voice. Really, it could never have been any better. Through Mary Robinson, now in the Paris Agreement, indigenous women's voices was actually added. If it was not for her, we would never have had that text being done there. And it's a very emotional issue for us because she was actually told, no, we're not going to bring an indigenous person there. And she did it. And now, at least we have, and we are the holders of knowledge. You can imagine, how would someone say no to the holders of knowledge? You have to give your knowledge. You have to come all the way just to explain that that is where we are. We are most affected, yet the least contributors of climate change. We are the ones who actually have those stoves that are smoky. We are the ones who are actually going for distances to fetch water and to fetch firewood. A long time ago when I was a child, we used to spend 1 hour to go and fetch water. These days, the same place that we used to go and fetch water is dry. Now we go for 2 hours. Now, as I talk right now, it's 4 hours. So you spend the whole of your day just to go and fetch 20 liters of water? Really? Is that not climate change? Who would deny that there is climate change right now? And the same cows that we used to have during the time of my grandfather and my grandmother, they look at us and they say, how do you survive? You start eating food from the shop, because we never used to eat food from the shop. It's food from the animals, the milk and the meat and the blood. Now you have to supplement that with a lot of other things that they don't understand, and they say, that's why we are sick. You don't know what's cancer. We hear about cancer, but these days it's right there with us. We have what we call brucellosis. We never used to have brucellosis. You drink water milk directly from the cow, and you have no sickness. And these days you have what we call brucella, and they ask us, what is that? The diseases that you have brought. They think we are the ones who brought the diseases. It's climate change. And we really thank God for your information, for your helping us to come and participate and give our knowledge. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you, Agnes. Stay here. Stay here. I think Agnes has put it very well. We have to all rise for climate action, all rise for climate responsive action, and really try in ensuring that the outcomes of this conference are in tune with what we've been talking about here, what we've been sharing, the lived experiences of women, the lived experiences of women like Alice, who must be heard at conferences like this. Thank you very much. Great.